Yes, well, we're going to look at the sort of general biology of skin color, not just the genetics. The genetics
Uh-huh.
is actually quite complicated,
Uh-huh.
but I will give you one particular example. Um, Now, this is some of the variation that we have in skin color all over the world, and uh, and that little song that John referred to, red and yellow, black and white. Um, Again, that is a simple song, and it's a rather simplistic view of what colors we have in skin. In fact, skin is a mixture of quite a few colors. Uh, and that's why skin colors, if you're an artist or a photographer, you'll know that getting really good, accurate flesh tones is quite an art. It's quite difficult. And that is because there are more than one color in human skin. So nobody is all red or all yellow, and certainly no one is all white. There is no white pigment in human skin. So let's just have a look at the colors we do have that show up when you look at someone and see their skin. So we do have red and yellow, and then we have a couple of shades of brown. One is a very dark brown, almost black, and one is a sort of red brown. And the interesting thing is that all people have all of these colors. So that's why it's more complicated than just one color. And that's why the genetics is extremely complicated with dozens and dozens of genes involved. So you can't just draw up your little genetic square and say, well, we've got a couple of colors here, and you've got combinations of those. So let's have a look at skin, which will help us understand why we see particular colors when we look at someone. Now, these are the layers that you've got in your skin. And if we start at the bottom, you have what's called the dermis, which is a sort of fibroelastic layer, and a layer of fibrous tissue, tough fibrous tissue, and elastic fibers, because when you pinch skin, it goes back to its normal shape. Sadly, that elasticity diminishes as you age, and that's one of the reasons we get wrinkles. Now, coursing through that are the blood vessels that nourish the skin, and that thick layer of cells above the dermis. So the dermis is the sort of light mottled layer at the bottom. The epidermis is the outermost layer of skin, which has to cope with being exposed to the outside world. So what it does is to make a substance called keratin, and also various oils and various other proteins, to give you a waterproof layer. Now, for those of you who live in Britain, that's not to keep the water out, although it does that. It's to stop the water from inside your body leaking out so that you don't dry out. But it is a waterproof layer. Now, the reason for the very irregular borderline between the epidermis and the dermis is so that you've got a big surface area, because that has to be tightly gripped onto the dermis so that it doesn't get scraped off and knocked off every time you touch something. So those are our three layers, and our different colors are more predominant in each of those three layers. So let's have a look at start at the bottom again. Red comes from hemoglobin, which is the pigment in your red blood cells. Red blood cells genuinely are red, and because you have a lot of blood cells close to the surface of your skin, you do actually see the red from that showing through. And the amount of blood that flows through the skin can vary quite a lot, because that is used for thermoregulation, for temperature control. So if you are hot, you know that your skin goes red, because a whole lot of blood vessels will open up, lots of blood gets diverted up there, and you can radiate out that heat. When you're cold, you tend to go rather pale, because only the minimum amount of blood is sent up there to make sure that the skin stays alive. And if it gets too cold, it will actually die. That's called frostbite. But so the amount of red varies. Now, some people do have a sort of naturally more florid or red complexion than others. because there is some variation in the amount of blood vessels that are there and the ones that stay open. Now let's go to yellow. Now yellow comes mainly from a group of chemicals called carotenoids, and they're found in food. Some of them are quite tasty, and they tend to get concentrated in the outermost layer. So they are easily seen in thick calloused skin. That's where that keratin layer is very thick. So if we go back to our picture here, so down at the bottom we have the dermis with the blood vessels. That's where the red is seen. Up the top we have keratin, where the carotenoids tend to get concentrated. And in the middle we have the epidermis, and it actually makes its own pigment, and it's melanin. You've probably heard of that. And there are actually two variants of melanin. One is called eumelanin, one is called pheomelanin. And there are a whole lot of genes that control the production of this, but they are both made in the same cells called melanocytes, and those are in the epidermis. So if we go back to our skin layers, now you can see where all the different colors are, but when you're looking from the outside, of course, you see a combination of those. And so that's why we get all the subtle variation in skin color. And it also explains why we get some of the extremes at the very end of the sort of spectrum, where we have very pale people and we have very dark people. So let's go back to the melanin, because that is the one that varies the most. Now, there is a really interesting thing about melanin. The number of melanocytes, that's the melanin-making cells, is much the same if you took the average from a whole lot of different people who would be classified as being in different racial groups. The number of those melanin-making cells is much the same. So what's different? All right. Now, well, let's have a look at some of those melanin cells, where they are. They sit along that borderline, right? Remember the this very curved borderline that you've got there, so that you've got a good grip from the epidermis to the dermis. They sit in the bottom layer, and there's an important reason for that, is that the epidermis is constantly being remade. So in that bottom layer, you've got a whole lot of cells which are reproducing, which means they are copying the DNA in those cells. And so those cells need to be protected from the sunlight from the outside world, from radiation. And that's the function of melanin. So the melanocytes sit there next to the keratin-making cells as the keratin-making cells are reproducing. And the melanocytes make melanin, and then they export it to the keratin-making cells. So in this piece of skin here, you can see where the melanocytes are, because in this person, they are very, very active. And that's the main difference between very dark people and very light people, not so much how many of those cells they've got, but how active they are. But even in this person, where they are very, very active, all the melanin seems to be at the bottom. But if you go up to the top where the keratin layer is, that's that fibrous looking layer at the top, it seems to have disappeared. And in fact, that does happen because the function of the keratin cells is to fill up with keratin and various oils and other waxes and other substances. And eventually those cells die, so that you've just got little flakes of the keratin cells left over. And that's the outermost layer. Now, they no longer need that protection because they're no longer dividing. Their DNA doesn't need to be protected. In fact, their DNA gets broken down in that process as well. But in some people, the melanin does actually persist right to the top. And so that's another reason that you get the variation. So the melanin cells export it to the keratin cells, and that explains how we get the variation. You've got variation in the ratio of the eumelanin and the pheomelanin. That's the very the reddish colored melanin and the very, very dark melanin. How active those melanocytes are and whether they persist whether the melanin persists in the keratin. Now, all of those things are controlled by different genes and by different chemical signals from the rest of your body. And so that's why it's not a simplistic thing to say that some people are red, yellow, black, or white. They are actually combinations of all three. But we do have distinctive color combinations. So all people have all colors. Different skin colors are variations of the same color combination. But we do get distinctive color combinations. Now, how do we explain that? Because in that picture I've got at the bottom, you've got people who are always very dark. You've got people who are always sort of middle brown. You've got people who are always very pale. And that might vary a bit during their lifetime, but they do have distinctive color combinations that we recognize. So how does it come about? Well, there is an evolutionary story, and you've probably heard this. Skin color evolved because of our relationship to the sun. This is the standard story. Melanin protects the skin from damage by ultraviolet light from the sun. So people with dark skin evolved where there was a lot of ultraviolet light because they needed that extra protection. However, skin does need some sunlight in order to make vitamin D. That's a vitamin that's involved in the control of calcium in the body. So we have lots of calcium in our bones. So you need vitamin D to make good, strong bones, particularly when you're growing and making new bones, but also for maintaining your bones throughout your life. But calcium is an important mineral that's used in lots of other body functions as well. So vitamin D is very important for normal body functions. So the standard story is, well, light skin evolved in the low ultraviolet regions. Well, let's check that out and see how it works. All right. So if we look at the world, which of course is round rather than being flat, there will be more ultraviolet light in the equator and the tropical regions. So that line going through the center there is the equator. And up the top, as you go towards the poles, it will get darker and darker. So we should get a sort of overall pattern of ultraviolet light, lots of it in the middle, and then it gets darker and darker as you go towards the poles where there's not much light. So does the pattern of skin colors of people who have lived in places for millennia, right, what we would call indigenous people, does the pattern of skin color match this? Now, it's actually quite difficult to do that now because for the last century or two, people have been wandering around the world and mixing and matching. But back in the earlier part of the 20th century, there was a study of different skin colors of what are called indigenous peoples or native peoples, which is probably a term that's out of fashion at the moment. But anyway, that there is this study where people looked at, scientists looked at the darkness and lightness of different skin colors. Now, going back to our map, right, does our map match with the distribution of skin colors? Well, it sort of works for Africa and Europe, particularly around equatorial Africa. You've got a lot of very dark people. In Europe, you've got a lot of very light people. Okay, that seems to work. It doesn't quite work. The region of the Sahara Desert actually has very, very high ultraviolet light, as does the Deccan Plateau, which is north of India, because it's very dry or very high up, so that the ultraviolet light penetrates. But it sort of works for Africa versus Europe. But what about for the Americas? Most of the people in America, that's before the rest of the world decided to move there, including a whole lot of people from Europe, right? The Native Americans starting from the Eskimos right up the top, going all the way down through the Americas. They're varying shades of middle brown. And in fact, most of the population of the world are varying shades of middle brown. Very, very light and very dark. So white, what we would call white and black in shorthand, are actually the minority. So it doesn't really work for the Americas. And it doesn't work for Australia either. Now look at Australia. They've coloured it completely dark there because the Australian Aborigines, whether they live at the top end or the bottom end, are all very dark. Now, as Joseph found out when he visited Australia, it's rather a large place. So it has a top end not far from the equator, but the bottom end is quite a long way. And the Aborigines who live down in the bottom end, and that island at the bottom there that sort of hangs off the mainland is called Tasmania. And the Tasmanian Aborigines are just as dark as the ones that you find up the top end, which is close to the equator. So that pattern of ultraviolet light doesn't work for Australia either, any more than it works for the Americas. Now, what about the other side of the evolutionary story, about the skin needing sunlight to make vitamin D? So we have light skin evolving in low ultraviolet regions. Well, a few years ago, we reported this in our newsletter, and it's on our fact file now. A study of skin color genes in European populations, and they looked at a particular gene called MC1R. You don't need to worry about that. And they found a mutation of this gene that results in lighter skin. And they surveyed the population of a few European countries, and they found that 10 to 20% of the population of Spain had this particular gene, and the highest rates were in regions with lower ultraviolet radiation. In other words, in the places that were a little bit further away from the equator. And they thought, wow, we've found a positive mutation. How often do you hear that, evolution works by mutations, but there's a problem with that because mutations the term has a bad connotation, and so it should, because mutations are not good. So they thought, wow, we found positive mutation. This mutation is positive because for the climate of the Mediterranean regions, as it facilitates the absorption of vitamin D in the winter months, in which the ultraviolet radiation is lower. Interesting. And the people who actually published this study in this journal here wrote this comment: we thus provide evidence for an adaptive. Now there's another term that's used by the evolutionists, and maybe one day we can look at that seriously in one of these programs. What does adaptation really mean? But anyway, we found evidence for adaptive value of human skin depigmentation, meaning lighter, right, in Europe, and illustrate how an adaptive process can simultaneously help to maintain a disease risk allele. What on earth do they mean by that? It doesn't sound very good. Hardly a positive mutation. Now, an allele is just a gene variant. Right. Now, what they mean by that is that this mutation is associated with an increased rate of melanoma, which is a type of skin cancer. Now, everyone knows that cancer is not good, right? And so they thought, oh, well, we have to deal with this. So they then went on to comment, melanoma has been an invisible illness to natural selection. In other words, it doesn't get selected out. It is the price that has to be paid for improved survival of the fittest species, in areas of the world with lower solar radiation. Now, anyone who has ever suffered from skin cancer can rise up and say to these people, phooey, there is nothing good or positive about having skin cancer. So let's do a bit of a reality check with the evolutionists' story, just using these two examples that I've just used here, the people in Spain and the Aborigines living in Australia. Okay, So up in Spain, people have evolved to be light because they're further away from the equator. Down in Australia, people have evolved to be dark. The interesting thing is those two groups of people are equally far away from the equator, right? The 40-degree line goes through the middle of Spain. It also goes through the Bass Strait, which is the bit of the sea that separates mainland Australia from Tasmania. So that doesn't work. How do we get the distinctive color combinations? Well, we started with a Bible verse. John has given us some history in the light of what we know of the biblical history of the world. So we need to go back to that. So if we can go back to John and to Joseph, and we'll look a bit more at the biblical history and how we can really explain how we get distinctive color combinations.